to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. My name is Lee Johnson, and I am pleased to be joined today by my good friends and co-hosts Rick Lee and Devanya Havis. And we also have a special guest with us here who we'll tell you about in just a second. And today we are talking about totalitarianism. But before we get to that, let's get some drink orders and some rants or raves. Devanya, what are you drinking?
Well, Lee, today I'm going to have a grasshopper, a non-alcoholic grasshopper.
Oh.
My favorite kind of grasshoppers.
All my grasshoppers are luscious.
Not the edible sort. Today I'm raving about sunlight. Need there be any explanation for a rave about sunlight?
No.
It is a glorious, wonderful thing.
Nice. Rick, what about you?
Today I'm going to have a rye Manhattan, and I am raving about jazz vocalist Betty Carter. As you might tell from my recent raves, I'm on this kick of listening to jazz vocalists. Betty Carter, we lost her, unfortunately, at the young age of 69. I have to say, I know this will be controversial, but I think she's the best scat singer there is.
Ooh.
The jazz singer Carmen McRae once said, "There's really only one jazz singer. Only one. Betty Carter."
Whoa.
Need I say more?
And who is that you have sitting there beside you?
I am so happy and excited to welcome to our bar my dear friend and colleague, Peg Birmingham. Let me just say, and this will make probably everyone jealous, I am so fortunate to have colleagues who are not just really amazing philosophers, but really great people. Peg can attest to this. We really do enjoy spending time with one another. So I'm happy to welcome Peg Birmingham. She's a professor of philosophy at DePaul University. Peg works in the areas of continental philosophy in general, political theory in particular, and feminist theory. She thinks about, works on, and teaches political thought, emphasizing Machiavelli, Hobbes, Arendt, Heidegger, Jacques Rancière, Agamben, and Foucault. She's published many essays in collected volumes and journals, and I'll mention two projects, Hannah Arendt and Human Rights. That was 2006 with Indiana. And I don't know, Peg, if this is still the title of your forthcoming book, but I think it's Deception, Violence, and Law. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Peg is also the editor of Philosophy Today, and she co-edits with former guest of the podcast and friend of the podcast, Dimitri Verdoulakis, a book series called Incitements with Edinburgh University Press. So Peg, welcome to the bar. We are all so excited to talk with you. But before that, we want to know, what are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with the three of you. And today I'm going to order a whiskey sour.
Nice.
And I am raving about a novel I just finished, actually published in 2023 by Jesmyn Ward, titled Let Us Descend. The title is actually taken from Virgil, who says to Dante, "Let us descend to the inferno." And Jesmyn Ward invites us, I suppose if that's the right word, takes us into the hell of the slave-owning South, narrated by a young girl named Annis. And it makes Dante's Inferno look like child's play. So I'm raving about that, although it's a very difficult read at the same time.
And Lee, what about you? What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
I'm just going to have 2 fingers of Buffalo Trace on a rock. Before I rant, I just want to quickly rave about Peg Birmingham, who is, in my opinion, one of the nicest people in the entire profession. So I'm so glad to have you here with us today, Peg. But today I am ranting, and I am ranting about the orphan crushing machine. So as far as I know, there is no such actual machine. I mean, I wouldn't put it past this world right now for there to be such a machine. But the orphan crushing machine is a meme that started, I think, maybe around 2020. Some user on Twitter tweeted out, every heartwarming human interest story in America is like, this person raised $20,000 to keep 200 orphans from being crushed by the orphan crushing machine. And nobody ever asks why there is an orphan crushing machine or why you would need to pay to prevent it from being used. You can file this under my more general complaints about GoFundMe. But I think that we are seeing more and more of these bizarre human interest stories. And we're not asking why our hearts are warmed by these stories. So, Rick, I know that we are talking about totalitarianism today. How did you want this conversation to go?
I think it's probably obvious to most of our listeners who are residing in the U.S. that the topic of our discussion today is pretty timely. It's timely not just in the U.S., but around the world. Since the Second World War, I think the world seemed easily divided between democratic capitalist countries and authoritarian, totalitarian, communist countries. Now, of course, this is an oversimplification because many communist countries were actually state capitalist societies, and many capitalist countries had state-owned industries, and they had really wide social welfare programs. But I think in Europe and North America in particular, there seemed to be a kind of democratic consensus that was settled on after the Second World War. These countries were democracies. They were opposed to any non-democratic forms of government, not only in their own countries, but around the world. But in recent years, that democratic consensus has broken. Like in Hungary, until recently also in Poland, currently in Russia, and I would argue, and I don't think there's much of an argument, now in the US, democracy is threatened primarily by authoritarian and totalitarian impulses and regimes. In the US, we throw around the terms fascist or authoritarian or totalitarian, and sometimes even the more vague oligarchy. And we do this with relative ease and without much definition. I think we don't really have a good handle on what these terms mean, both theoretically and in practice. If we are in an age in which democracy is on the wane, how did that happen? And what's coming up to take its place? Are we on the brink of totalitarianism, an oligarchy, authoritarianism, or an ugly soup of all of them mixed together? I'm willing to cede the bar to the authority of the bartender. The bartender can be a totalitarian. I think that goes without saying. But I am worried about ceding all power to someone like the president. So let's get to the bottom of what possibilities are if democracy is dying. Before we get into the nitty-gritty about totalitarianism and authoritarianism and oligarchy, I thought we'd first talk about democracy, since that seems to be what's under threat right now. I mean, if we look at democracy literally, like it's the kratos of the demos, the power of the people, is that a sufficient definition, or do we want to get more specific with what democracy means?
Well, Rick, I've been thinking about this question of democracy and the demos because I think it needs to be much more clarified exactly what it is we mean by the demos. I'm thinking about Wendy Brown's book on democracy without the demos, which is really, I think, legitimate and correct critique of neoliberalism, in which capitalism and its organizations, for lack of a better word, have really been the state of the government, as it were. But I'm not so sure then we just want to reinstall the people at the heart of democracy, because it's been a very checkered demos. And I think we're seeing it right now. It's not as if we're living in a time of democracy without the demos. The problem for me is that the demos, and this, I think, it goes back to the revolutions of 1776 and 1789, very quickly, the revolutionary moment, where we could think of a revolutionary demos, from the beginning devolved into a national demos. A demos from the start, nationalistic. It defined itself in terms of a homogeneous group united by a common history, common tradition, common language, all of this as is well known. And let me just say one other thing. I've been teaching Schmidt this quarter in the graduate class I've been teaching. In his concept of the political, he's very clear on page 1 that he's defining a democratic folk. A folk in which the state and society are one and the same, what he calls a total society of the people, and makes a claim, but I think it's a nationalistic claim that he doesn't speak in those terms, of the friend-enemy distinction. That once you have a nationalistic understanding of the people, then it seems by extension you get the friend-enemy distinction. Those are included, those that are not. So I think it's not that we don't have a democracy without a demos at the moment. The threat to democracy, any kind of radical or revolutionary democracy, is what we're living through, a Christian nationalistic demos that is defining everything from, gender is defined as binary and at birth. The religion is Christianity. The language is English. So I think we have to be very clear on what we mean by the demos at work in democracy.
In a way, it sounds like more democracy, less demos. But you pointed out that Carl Schmitt, early 20th century political and legal theorist, who was a one-time Nazi and then was out of the party and was in a bit of danger, that he talks about politics as the distinction between friend and enemy. And as soon as you said that, I thought of the rhetoric we hear from President Trump and other people in the administration, like the media are the enemy of the people. The Democrats are the enemy of the people.
Professors are the enemy of the people.
We professors are also people enemies, or maybe just enemies because we're not people. So it does seem clear to me that before we even get to democracy or totalitarianism, if we start with the notion of politics as the fundamental distinction between friend and enemy, we're always going to end up in a non-democratic, if not anti-democratic situation.
Yeah, I think that's true. And then you link that friend and enemy distinction to what I think is animating it, which in the case of democracy has been a nationalistic democracy. Hannah Arendt pointed to this, and we're starting to see this. The internal enemy, which Schmitt also talks about, can be denationalized. It can be thrown out. The enemy can be thrown out of the borders, even if it's a citizen or a permanent resident, such as Mahoud Khalil, taken to Louisiana. But this is just a step, it seems to me, in not only his case, hopefully not, but the way that then groups are denationalized, they lose their citizenship, they lose their protection under the law, and then they're rounded up again. Only this time there's no law. And I'm very worried that we're beginning to see that happening in this country. I hope not, but that also, I think, is part of this nationalistic democracy and who has rights and who doesn't.
I want to go back to the folk. And I suppose what I want to ask is why you're using the word nationalistic and not racist. When we hear Trump and Vance and the crew speak about who is an enemy or who is a friend to democracy, they're clearly thinking about the folk of our democracy in racist terms.
Lee, I couldn't agree more with you, and I actually think they're synonymous. Nationalism is inherently racism. Etienne Balibar has this wonderful essay titled Nationalism and Racism, and what he points out is that the declaration of any new national state in the modern period is accompanied by a genocide. Whether it's the declaration of the United States, the genocide of the Native Americans, Israel, and the expulsion of Palestinians, I couldn't agree more with you, Lee, that there is an inherent link between nationalism and racism.
So just to close the loop, as they say in corporate America, are you saying that...
Wait, are we going to circle back?
We're going to circle back. If you could put a pin in this. But just to close the loop, are you saying that there can be no democratic state that is not a racist state?
Well, I wouldn't want to go that far. I wouldn't want to say there aren't possibilities for democracy the self-determination of a group of citizens, not necessarily defined as a folk, but let's just say the self-determination of a group of citizens that I don't think has ever been realized. I think if you look at the Declaration of 1776, you see the references to the good people of the colonies. And we know that so many were excluded, namely the hundreds of thousands of enslaved. They were not part of the good people entitled to self-rule. When we get to 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizens, there was an attempt to think about the notion of citizenship much more in terms of a universal category, the universal rights of human beings, which of course had to be politically instituted. So it was thinking the tension between the universality of human rights, the right to freedom, the right to equality, with the needed political instantiation of that. Otherwise, these rights are just abstract and politically meaningless.
If we think about demos as being for the people and about the people, the question of who counts as the people seems crucial to how we understand democracy and how democracy works. As you were saying, the dilemma of making sure that we have a political apparatus that does ensure rights. And I'm struck by the way that a lot of the conversation has moved from rights talk to justice talk. So if we think about disability rights contrasted with disability justice, or reproductive rights contrasted with reproductive justice. And I'm wondering if you see any structural kind of shift happening there that speaks to the principles of what we mean by democracy, that is not so much hinged upon rights, but that may be working to develop a collective understanding of action and political meaning for collectivity.
I really like that suggestion because it points to something about the limitation of rights language in terms of it being a juridical concept, a legal concept, which, if we're thinking about a true democracy, would have to be rooted itself in the power of the people for the people. So I think you really bring up something extremely important here in terms of justice as pointing to the need for collective solidarity. And from out of that would emerge a different notion of rights, much more extensive. I think we could then get to thinking about that notion of the collective as going beyond national boundaries, rethinking the people and who the people are through a notion of justice and collective solidarity. I think we could get to a notion of the international.
This points, though, to what is prevalent throughout the history of political theory in thinking about democracy. So you have figures like Plato and Aristotle. Hobbes would be another figure who, when they look at democracy, they say, look, this is inevitably going to turn into a tyranny or chaos. It's going to crumble under its own weight, its own unruliness, and so on. Or, on the other hand, a figure like Kant or even Marx to a certain extent, who would say, look, if you really want true democracy, it has to be international, right? So either the thrust of democracy, a la Aristotle in that line, is always back to unruly chaos and the tyranny of the violence of the majority, or a la Kant and Marx, democracy is impossible without it becoming international or a global cosmopolitan organization.
Yeah, I think that's right, Rick. And I think particularly if we think of the way that imperial capitalism is linked to racism and a nationalistic democracy. As Arendt says at one point in Totalitarianism, racism is the driving engine of imperial capitalism, and for her it was also inherent in the birth of the nation state. So I think you're right. If we want to think, just to go back to Devania's wonderful intervention of a collective solidarity, I think it has to be international in scope. And that, of course, leads into the question, how do we make that political and not merely abstract or a moral demand? So if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948 through the United Nations, the limitation of that document, in my view, is that it is self-consciously a moral document. It says we appeal to the moral conscience of mankind in the face of the barbarism of the 20th century. But that document ends by continuing to cede political decisions to sovereign nation states. So I think the work politically, and certainly conceptually, is how do we think a notion of the international, an international politics that doesn't remain just abstract or appeal to a kind of ethical relation.
Well, alert, everyone. A proceduralist just entered the chat. And I would like to say that the rule of law is one of those helpful solutions. I think that in many people's minds, myself included, that when we talk about authoritarianism and totalitarianism in contrast to democracy, the primary difference between those forms is that democracy allegedly respects the rule of law and authoritarianism and totalitarianism do not. I'd like to hear you speak a little bit about the role of the rule of law.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. I've been thinking a lot about that. And I agree with you. I think that the law is essential in democracy. I think that's why there's a kind of glide between thinking of a democracy as a republic, a democratic republic. I like a kind of hyphen there to remind us that democracy is above all a rule of law rooted in the power of the people. Again, a much expansive notion there. So then the question becomes, how do we think the concept of law in a radical democracy, and a democracy that can counteract this nationalistic, racist democracy that we're in? One way we might think of it, and this is for me just a first moment, and I am following Hannah Arendt here, the difference between the Roman notion of law as nomos, the wall around a city, and lexis, the law as legally instantiating relations between different groups, between different political organizations, this notion of the law as alliance. And I think with our heavily militarized, racialized borders, racist borders, we're still thinking the Greek notion of law as nomos, walling up the city, keeping the enemy out. And Rick, we share a great love of Hobbes, but he continues that.
Sure.
The military is on the border of the Leviathan.
Yeah, and following from that, it seems to me that we come to a very difficult issue. If we're going to make a distinction between law as nomos versus law as lex, then the question would be, what's the basis for that decision? I'm wondering, is there a purely political definition of democracy, or are we always going to have to point elsewhere, either to ethics or to nature or to ontology, being, in order to say, look, this notion of law as lex is better. The notion of law as relationality is better. Is it politically better? Is it morally better? Is it better ontologically speaking? One of the difficulties here is to not think that democracy needs to be grounded in something like ethics. And I would imagine you don't want to also ground it in something like ontology, because that gets us to a certain Hobbesian position. And so is there a way we could politically ground democracy as politics?
Well, I just finished a very short piece co-editing that journal, Philosophy, Critique, and Politics.
Published, by the way, by our friends Edinburgh University Press.
I wonder if we have to turn things around and not go immediately to the issue of how are we going to ground a politics, a democratic politics. I think that's going to put us back into the ethical, which for me is always a kind of absolute discourse. So I wrote this little piece called Politics Before Being. What if we started by recognizing that the political, the way that we organize ourselves, is a response to a problematic.
Exactly.
There's a problem. So Hobbes didn't just write Leviathan out of his ontology. I think his ontology followed from the political space in which he found himself. The problematic for Hobbes was, how do we stop these religious wars, the 100-Year War, the decimating 30-Year War? And in a sense, the Leviathan is a philosophical reflection on the Westphalian Treaty of 1648.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the problematic, and I think this may explain in part the rabid Christian nationalism at the moment. I don't want to compare it to prior violence, but the nation state, the Westphalian model, is not going to hold. The problematic we have in front of us is climate catastrophe, as well as the catastrophe of capitalism, in which so much of the southern hemisphere is going to be uninhabitable. It's already uninhabitable economically because of capitalism and the extraction of resources. But let's add to that, it's just going to be uninhabitable. And strong militarized borders is not going to stop the flow of refugees that have to live somewhere else. And I think that's one of the problematics driving this reaction against immigration. But also, I think for those of us who are thinking about a concept of the political, how do we think of a concept of the political that can respond to that problematic?
Think back to the first time you listened to Hotel Bar Sessions. Maybe you came upon an episode randomly. Maybe a friend sent it to you. Maybe you weren't even sure what you were getting into, but then, pow, you were hooked. You kept listening. You started looking forward to new episodes, and now you're part of this conversation. But here's the thing. This show only exists because people like you support it. So if you've ever laughed, argued with us out loud, or sent an episode to a friend, it's time to step up. Become a patron at patreon.com/Hotel Bar Sessions. Or, if a monthly pledge isn't your thing, visit hotelbarpodcast.com to make a one-time contribution. You've been here this long, why not pull up a chair and assist with keeping the bar open?
Well, Peg, we asked you a lot about democracy, but this conversation is supposed to be about authoritarianism. So I would like to ask you, just straightforwardly, what do you think are the most blatant, worrisome indicators that the United States right now is moving towards authoritarianism, if it's not there already?
Lee, thank you for that. I think that with every passing day, we are in authoritarianism. There seems to be no stopping the kinds of executive orders and destruction. Every day we see it getting worse and worse. And it is interesting that the New York Times finally, the headline, I think yesterday or this morning was, we are inching towards a constitutional crisis because the executive branch is simply ignoring the rule of law. It simply will not bring those planes back or stop them. And that to me is an indication that we're well within it now. This is not to say that the rule of law has broken down. I don't think it has, but I think we're in very, very dangerous times. So that would be one worry I would have, Lee, one worrisome sign. And with that, I think that this all could fall under a broad definition of denationalization. Those who were put on planes and taken to El Salvador, these could easily be citizens or permanent residents. We simply don't know who has been shipped out.
Yeah.
This is not to say any of those who have been taken should be taken. So that for me is one very, very worrisome sign. Another is that we have a person who has not been elected in any capacity, making all of the decisions, assuming an executive power, but unelected. So that would be another sign.
It seems to me that political theory, at least since the 16th century, has kind of settled on the either necessity or benefit of separating out three different governmental powers, or maybe we could just call them political powers: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And one thing you're pointing to, Peg, is the erosion of that distinction. And so when the courts say to the executive, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and the executive says, no, I don't, it seems as if the executive is assuming at that very moment judicial power. And I think you pointed rightly to executive orders as a form of usurpation of legislative power. And so I'm wondering, is one main sign of totalitarianism the totalization of these forms of political power in, if not one person, then certainly in one group, one branch of what should be three branches?
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think that this term that's being used at the moment, the unitary concept of the presidency, speaks exactly to that, Rick. There is a claim that the president has total power. The president and the cabinet have total power. Now we are inching towards, well, certainly authoritarianism and dangerously close to totalitarianism. I think the difference, if I may, and we're starting to see it, is the use of terror. The systematic use of terror is what defines a totalitarian regime in contrast to an authoritarian regime. Certainly being put on planes and taken to a different country or Guantanamo or taken out of your house without warrant by a group of thugs and put into a van, which is what seems to have happened with Mahmoud Khalil. These are moments of terror.
Yeah.
But I think we still are some ways towards a systematic use of terror.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those examples that you just gave are pretty stark examples of the use of terror, but there are many others. Look at Trump's demand that governors don't allow trans athletes to play in NCAA sports in their state, as if anybody has control over the NCAA, first of all. But second of all, that's a power of the governors or a power of the executive branch. That is also an exercise of terror, I think. It seems to me very clear that there has been a concerted effort on the part of the current administration to say, if you are queer, if you are trans, you should be afraid.
Lee, thank you for adding that. It was a real oversight on my part not to include the way terror is being used against the trans community. I mean, it's just inconceivable to me, but of course it happened, that in the inaugural speech itself, there was already a clear indication that terror was going to be used against the trans community in the definition of gender as two genders established at birth. So I agree completely with you. And I think that's the way totalitarianism works. It's just one group after another. And what worries me, if I can just add to that, I don't mean to diminish all of the voices that are protesting, but there also seems to be a kind of complicity, also rooted in fear. Like there's just not the protest that we saw with the first Trump administration.
Yeah.
And that worries me profoundly.
What I think we often overlook is in totalitarian regimes like Hitler's Germany or Mussolini's Italy, it wasn't the centralization of terror, but in fact the ubiquity of it or the decentralization of it. It's not that the government is the only one instilling terror, but the president says gender is sex and there are only two and it's established at birth. That then gets spread among individuals who now are licensed to engage in acts of terror here, there, and everywhere.
Yeah, it quite literally authorizes it.
Yeah.
It's an authoritarian move.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. It authorizes the use of terror by many, many groups. And I like, Rick, what you also said about the decentralization of terror. You never know where it's going to come from.
Yeah.
You're always off kilter. You don't know exactly where to protest or what countermeasures. Other than I do think that we need to see really a mass mobilization of protest in this current moment. I don't think it's enough that I certainly support the economic boycotts of these businesses, but that's an economic boycott, not a political boycott.
Yeah.
And I think we need politically on the street, not just, I won't buy my face wash at Target. We're way past that moment, if I may just say.
It's difficult to consume your way to the revolution.
I agree with you both. I think that those kinds of protests are pretty small beans given our current status. But I'm also, of course, aware, as I'm sure everyone in this conversation is, that the institution of terror that we were just talking about has alienated us from one another, that it's very hard to find groups that can say, all right, we're all in a position where we either have the willingness or the capacity to get out there and risk our lives, our livelihoods, whatever, in order to stop this.
And I think following from that, there could be a number of communities in the US who, upon hearing this discussion, say, welcome to our world. Like, we've been experiencing this the entire time. And I think we need to acknowledge that. You know, even though we want to talk about democracy on the wane in the US, we also need to insist it never was realized, or at least never fully realized in the US. I'm not saying the use of terror is new, but it is spreading. And Peg points to one important way, namely the denationalization of people who might be citizens or residents without any legal process at all.
Well, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, we had Paul Brinus on the podcast, who was a former freedom rider. And one of the things he said that really has stuck with me is that we need to find different ways to protest, different ways to object, different ways to refuse. And he noted that many of those ways, some of those ways, might have to look like things that we wouldn't really call politics. In particular, he noted humor. I think that we've seen a lot of this from the Gen Zs and the Gen Ys on TikTok and various platforms. And many people have written about the fact that at the end of the day, our president is a celebrity president. He's not a politician. He never was a politician. And the only thing that really affects him is the kinds of things that would affect a celebrity. He doesn't want to be embarrassed. He wants to keep the plot interesting. He doesn't want to provide any resolutions because that's not how reality TV works. Reality TV works by us all thinking that something even more exciting is going to happen in the next episode. So I really do think that, as trite as it can sound, to say, look, we can't do freedom movements. We can't do protests like we did it in the 60s anymore. We have to do it in an entirely different way. And one of those ways might be literally embarrassing the president. I think we have to take that seriously.
I really love that. I think that that's an important way to protest at the moment. The one thing that he cannot stand is to be ridiculed and to point out just how ridiculous he is. I mean, it's also very violent and very cruel, but he's also ridiculous. And that may be the only way to protest. I think you're right, Lee, because he revels in cruelty. He revels in violence. He's unfazed by it. But ridicule and laughter, I think, is a very effective political instrument.
He loves ratings and he hates being laughed at. And so I think particularly in the face of this president, laughing at him, i.e. comedy, can be really effective.
Yeah. Heads up, listeners, we left Twitter. We packed up, shut the lights off, and logged out permanently. Not because it stopped being fun, but because it stopped being ethical. So if you're looking for us online, don't go lurking in Elon's hellscape anymore. Instead, follow us where the real conversation happens, on Blue Sky. That's where we're sharing our episode updates, behind-the-scenes content, and all the half-baked takes we used to share on Twitter. If you love what we do here, don't just sit there. Press pause now and go follow us. You can find us at Hotel Bar Sessions on Blue Sky. No ads, no bots, no billionaire nonsense, just the good stuff. And it is our very strong preference that we keep our conversation with you going on that platform. Of course, you can also find us on Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube, and we appreciate your likes or follows on all of those platforms. Now, back to the conversation.
Ridicule may be one mechanism to address a celebrity president, and perhaps we do need a rethinking of mass movements as the primary political mode of operating, both as individuals and in a collective sense. I'm struck by the differing ways that we are precarious. I think it's very different to be out on the streets when you're existing while Black So I wonder what individual actions we can take, as well as how we might build collectivities that move things along. I keep thinking this because one of the things that my daughters keep saying to me when I talk about the current moment is Andrew Jackson. And I don't think it is any mistake that many of these executive orders are signed at Andrew Jackson's desk. The rule of law has been a protection for some people, but not all U.S. citizens. So I'm just profoundly curious for myself about what action is available, and also wondering, as we think collectively, what kinds of actions we believe are possible.
I think that really is the core question, because when you think about not just the concept, but the reality of totalitarianism or authoritarianism, one of the things that really quickly diminishes on the horizon is what actually is still possible. And an effective authoritarian, an effective totalitarian regime will, as much as possible, eliminate possibilities. And so I agree with Devanya. This is a hugely important question, and I'd love to hear from Peg what is still possible.
Oh my, Devanya, you really raised the most important question, and it goes back to your earlier comment about building collective solidarity and how do we do that? I'm not so sure I have a very good answer to that, other than to follow what I heard in your drawing our attention to this. It has to be a solidarity with the most vulnerable in our communities, to strategize about how we can best do that, how to protect the most vulnerable among us, those who have already, since the inception of the Republic, been marginalized. And I think it requires a lot of listening. How can we best help? I think sometimes the majority group doesn't do enough listening to vulnerable communities and how solidarity could be most effective. So I've been thinking a lot lately about listening as a form of political protest, the beginning of political protest. I don't know, Devanya, if that resonates with how you're thinking collective solidarity.
I think it resonates, and I'm struck by the fact that Paul Brinus also mentioned radical listening as a component of how we might begin to foster collective resistances or oppositions to the kinds of things that are going on. Also, I'm not opposed to pursuing legal means or juridical directions to combat some of this. And I think, as we've noted, a number of these executive orders have been ruled against by the judiciary. But I am not confident that that alone is going to move us toward the pushback that we need.
Yeah.
And I am not always a fan of electoral politics, but I am increasingly disappointed at the kind of opposition that is coming from my elected representatives, who seem to not have developed any way to combat this, especially if we think that Project 2025 is in many ways the architecture for much of what's beginning to happen. I keep thinking, well, what could we have anticipated? What can I, as a professor in a classroom, do? And I think educating is part of it, but also helping people to think about what kinds of actions are indeed resistive actions or community building actions.
I agree with everything that you just said, Devanya, especially the sentiment that our elected representatives on the left can just go take a long walk off a short plank. But if I could just throw a wrench into the conversation about active listening, I worry sometimes that we haven't found a way to effectively counter the narrative of Trump's right, the MAGA right, that's exactly what they were doing. They were actively listening to the quote unquote most vulnerable among us. They were the ones who were engaging in this revolutionary movement to eliminate waste and fraud and excess, or try to reinstate true moral sensibilities and get rid of the, as Elon Musk calls it, the woke virus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Part of the project of actively listening to the most vulnerable among us, obviously, first of all, involves identifying who are the most vulnerable among us. And that right now seems to me to be at the core of the contest between those who think that democracy is failing and that we're creeping towards authoritarianism and totalitarianism on the one side, and then on the other side, those who think that democracy is actually being restored.
If I can add to that, there are two main examples we're dealing with right now. On the one hand, we have the Senate who capitulates in the form of voting for the Republican continuation of the budget. And on the other hand, we have Columbia University capitulating to the Trump administration. And I think in each of these, what is not heard, what is not listened to, is, as we said in a recent conversation on the podcast, we are all in a situation of precarity, but it's not evenly distributed. What my precarity ought to allow is to understand that what connects us, if nothing else, is that very precarity, and therefore I should be open to the claims of precarity whenever they're voiced. Now, I don't think that gets us, Lee, where you want, like when a white guy from Oklahoma says, well, my life is precarious, and these woke people give all the power to, African-American students or employees. I don't give a rule for deciding that that's bullshit. But the issue of precarity is one way, and I borrow this from Judith Butler, obviously, one way that connects us that could be the basis for an active listening.
But that precarity is the water and the soil of authoritarianism and totalitarianism. I do believe in the demos, at least this much. You're not going to have an authoritarian or totalitarian state if the demos is secure. And one of the things that is hardest to deal with right now, I believe, for many people just to accept, is that we are a people who are sick, who are poor, who are indebted, who are demoralized, and that is perfect soil for authoritarianism and totalitarianism.
Lee, I couldn't agree more with you on that. And I think that's where the resistance has to start. Certainly, Rick, you're right that there's an uneven distribution of precarity. But I think what we have to do, and this comes back to Devonia, is to try to develop a sense of political solidarity among and with groups of vulnerable and precarious people, and not get into a big fight about who is more precarious than others.
Right.
And I want to come back to something that Devonia said at the beginning of the podcast about the question of justice. I think there has to be more talk about justice in this conversation in which we're listening, which seems so ineffectual, even when I say it sometimes. But I think this question of material justice, of economic justice, has got to be part of the conversation, and to bring that into a conversation about democracy, so that it's not just about rights, not just about the law, but a conversation about equality. I think that is the fundamental principle of democracy, and how best to achieve that.
Oof, we all know what that sound means. Last call. But just because we're closing out here doesn't mean the conversation has to end. Head on over to hotelbarpodcast.com to find our past episodes, detailed show notes, and all the books and articles we've name-dropped tonight. Looking for a specific topic? Want to revisit an old favorite? We've made it easy to search our archive by theme, guest, or keyword. So no more scrolling through endless episodes trying to find that one time Rick said something I actually couldn't have disagreed with anymore. Just click the search bar. And hey, while you're there, tell us what you want to hear next by clicking the Contact Us link. And be sure to subscribe to Hotel Bar Sessions wherever you listen to podcasts through the links that we've provided. We'll be back at the bar next week, of course. Same time, same place, same degenerate company, and we'll have a bar stool saved just for you.
As I mentioned at the beginning, there is one absolute authority in the bar, and that's the bartender. And unlike the Trump administration, we are going to abide by her decision. Peg, I want to thank you so much. This has been a really insightful conversation, a lot of fun. And for those of you who are listening, I want to make you jealous again and say that Peg and I have conversations like this all the time in many bars, in many places around the world. So thank you so much, Peg, for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Devonia. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I hope to continue it at another bar, at another place, and very soon.
Bet. Thanks so much, Peg.
Good night.
Bye.